Can you imagine a war that lasts longer than your entire lifetime? A conflict so long that your grandparents could have been born fighting it and your grandkids might see its end? It sounds crazy, right? But that's exactly what we're talking about today.
Yup, 116 years, from 1337 all the way to 1453. We call it the Hundred Years' War, but that's really selling it short. For the people living through it, it was just life, a seemingly endless cycle of conflict that would completely change both England and France forever.
So the big question is, how on earth does something like that even happen? What could possibly fuel a war for over a century? Well, as we're about to see, the answer is a wild story of family drama, new technology, and an unlikely hero who changed everything.
Now, you might think a war this massive started with some huge invasion, but nope, the spark was actually much more personal. It was basically a family feud over who got to be king of France. It all boils down to these two guys. On the left, you've got England's King Edward III. He had a really solid claim to the French throne because his mom was a French princess. But the French nobles weren't having it. They basically said, sorry, the crown can't pass through a woman, and instead they picked Philip VI, a cousin of the old king. As you can imagine, Edward felt completely robbed. And that's it. That's the heart of the whole conflict. One throne in France, two men who believed it was theirs by right. It was the perfect recipe for a disaster that would last 116 years. So the fighting begins, and honestly, everyone probably thought France, being bigger and wealthier, would have this in the bag. But England showed up with a piece of military tech that was about to turn the medieval battlefield completely upside down. Meet the English longbow. You have to understand, this thing was a total game changer. It was like the machine gun of its era. A skilled archer could shoot arrows way faster and with enough power to punch right through the thick plate armor of a French knight from a distance. Suddenly, England had a terrifying advantage. But this wasn't just about winning battles, it was psychological warfare. Imagine being a French knight, the pinnacle of medieval society, and getting taken down by a storm of arrows fired by a common foot soldier. It pierced through armor and shattered the idea of chivalry itself. It was terrifying, humiliating, and it completely broke the French way of fighting. So for decades, England is just dominating. France is on the brink of total collapse. And then, when all hope seems lost, one of the most incredible figures in history steps onto the stage. A teenage peasant girl who claimed God had sent her to save France. Her story is just unbelievable, and it happens so fast. In 1429, she says she's hearing voices from God. In that same year, she convinces the French army to follow her and leads them to a shocking victory, lifting the siege of Orleans. But just a year later, she's captured by her enemies, put on a sham trial, and in 1431, she's executed. It's an incredibly short and tragic life, but her impact was just getting started. See, in death, Joan of Arc became more powerful than she ever was in life. She wasn't just a leader anymore. She was a martyr, a saintly symbol for France. Her spirit became a rallying cry that gave the French people a sacred cause to fight for, not just for their king, but for their home. And it worked. Inspired by her sacrifice, the French completely turned things around. Under their king, Charles VII, they started fighting smarter, using new tactics, and they began to claw back their territory, city by city. The entire momentum of the war had shifted for good. You can really see the switch flip right here. For the first 90 or so years, it was all England, with these massive, shocking victories like at Crécy and Poitiers. But after 1429, the year Joan of Arc showed up, it's a whole new story. The momentum is all France's, leading to decisive victories that would finally drive the English out. You know, for a war this long, the ending was almost quiet. There was no big treaty signing ceremony. It just kind of petered out. By 1453, England was exhausted, nearly bankrupt, and had been pushed off the continent almost entirely. The English dream of ruling France was over. So, after 116 years of fighting, what did it all really achieve? Well, the true legacy of this war isn't found on a map. It's about how it completely reshaped England and France from the inside out. This is the key takeaway. Before the war, your loyalty was probably to your local lord. But after 100 years of fighting the French, or the English, people started to develop a new sense of identity.
They began to see themselves as part of a nation. It was no longer about fighting for some distant king's dynastic claim, it was about fighting for France or fighting for England. This idea weakened the old feudal system and really laid the groundwork for the modern countries we know today. The fighting stopped over 500 years ago, but the war's consequences are still with us every day in the very identities of England and France. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? When a conflict is that long and that bitter, do its echoes ever really fade away?